Welcome back, everybody. I'm really very, very grateful for Professor Andrzejewski. I hope I said that right for you. Uh, Andrzejewski, Professor Andrzejewski will be giving us a presentation as a Shakespearean scholar in English language and literature, a classicist. Who will enlighten us and give us some hope and optimism about um, what we can do about academic coasting. So thank you, Alicia.
Hi, I don't know, that's a lot of promises, but we'll see what we can do. Hi everyone. Thank you to those of you who are here. I'm really excited to be here and to have been invited to speak along scholars doing such an exciting work in such different disciplines from mine. So a little bit about me. I am, as Carl said, an assistant professor in William and Mary's English department. I was hired as a Shakespearean who also does work in cultural studies more broadly, so queer theory, gender studies, critical race studies, etc. And my first book, which will be out next year, is on what I call queer pregnancy in Shakespeare's plays. In short, pregnancies either experienced by characters that scholars invested in queer lives would identify as queer, or pregnancy more broadly that challenges the ways in which reproduction is culturally organized. But I'm also invested in public scholarship, which is the work that brought me here today. In addition to publishing on a wide range of topics, and by wide I mean everything from houseplants to the recent Jonas Turner celebrity divorce, I also write for the Chronicle of Higher Education. And it is in this role, let me see, and is in this role I am most aligned, I feel like, with the Guardians of Truth and Integrity's conference's mission, as I write about issues I see in the academy and attempt to give viewpoints that have been historically marginalized attention. Anecdotes, stories, information that has typically, at least from my perspective, not garnered as much attention as it should. And I will just pause to say a little bit about my methodology. It's a little intimidating to be, asked to speak besides statisticians who are working very closely and deliberately on things like sample sizes and controls and variables and all of that, because truly my methodology is a little all over the place. But for these articles, what I typically do is they are almost always something very personal to me. So an issue that I lived through or have experienced that I felt at the time I didn't have the resources for. And then what I do is I interview people. And in terms of how I find people to interview, there are often people in my life, in my circles, but I'll put out calls on social media and see who responds. So currently, I'm working on a piece for the Chronicle on what I call the problem of pregnancy in the academy. And so I put out a call on Twitter for sources, and about 120 people responded. And so now I'm working to create more formal questionnaires and interview questions. But when I started this work in the beginning, I would just have conversations with people, record them, and pull the quotes that I felt um, shown shown light on the issues. So that's upfront my methodology. I have always have a strong personal investment. You could call it bias, but the expertise of lived experience. And I talk to people and I record their stories and I listen to what they have to say. So that's how I write these pieces. And as you'll notice as I go through this presentation today, a lot of my sources request to remain anonymous. Um, And so I don't name them or their institution. And the Chronicle has so far, because of the nature of what I write about, let me get away with this. So you'll, if that's a problem for you, excuse me. But I do respect my sources who want to remain anonymous. So my first piece for the Chronicle was about my experience being harassed by 2 male students while I was a graduate instructor at the City University of New York. And so for this piece, I interviewed many female academics who have had similar experiences and called for institutions to do more to protect what I called its most vulnerable instructors. And as I say at the end of this piece, I do not dream of being able to swiftly remove students from my classroom. I dream about an academy where I can teach authentically and without fear, an academy where complaints from disempowered members of our community, whether instructors or students, are freely spoken, and an academy where all of us, not just those being scraped away, are invested in hearing and addressing these complaints. And then my most recent piece for the Chronicle was on navigating the academy with mental illness, as someone who is diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which is a disease that is still incredibly stigmatized and misunderstood. And so for this piece, I talked to many academics who struggled with mental illness as well, including depression, bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, anorexia, etc. And all of them agreed that the way that academia is structured exacerbates existing mental illnesses and in some cases causes them. And we agreed that while academics often talk colloquially about being anxious and depressed, we don't talk enough about mental illness, especially less common diagnoses. As one of the people I talked to said, academics pretend to tolerate neurodivergence when what they really mean is that it's acceptable to be anxious about all the work you have to do. But ultimately, in this piece, I argued that those of us who struggle with mental illness are desperate to fight the stigmas associated with their respective diagnoses, for others to know that our need for accommodation is not a personal failure, that we just operate and think differently, and that this is why it is crucial to accommodate us. To diverge is to differ, to deviate, to continually depart from a standard, a norm. And it follows then that neurodivergent academics are trailblazers. They offer the academy something more than already exists. But the piece that I'm here to talk about today, to meditate on the conference themes of reliability and integrity in the academy, is one in which I address the phenomenon of academic ghosting, where a person you have a professional relationship with disappears suddenly, as if dead, ending the relationship without explanation. People who ghost others cease all direct communication, ignore, and pretend not to know those who they were once in contact with. And like literal ghosts, these people prove difficult or impossible to trace, yet are somehow still here, remaining a persistent and disturbing presence in the minds or thoughts of a person. These remnants linger on after the person's disappearance, haunting those they knew, often as in ghost stories, because of unresolved endings. So I conducted interviews with dozens of academics, from graduate students to department chairs, who were haunted by the ghosts of academics who disappeared, academics who avoided truth-telling and difficult conversations, because ultimately, this is at the heart of ghosting, right? The desire to avoid or the inability to have a difficult conversation. And at the end of it all, I concluded that academia is a haunted house full of ghosts and those that they leave behind to navigate it, and that the silence is often startling. So I talk about this in the article, and this is actually what inspired the piece, is the first time a colleague ghosted me. And it was about 2 months into a burgeoning friendship and collaboration. And for months, we texted constantly, reviewed each other's writing projects, talked about work, gossiped about the latest academic Twitter drama. But then abruptly, without any explanation, my colleague ceased all communication. Like a literal ghost, they became impossible to trace, but there remained a persistent presence in my thoughts. And to say I was devastated is perhaps dramatic, but I was. I must have done something egregious. They must have had a good reason to do this to me, right? Now and then I still run through possibilities of what could have happened in my head. I'll try to conjure up an imaginary terrible thing I could have possibly said or done, and then imagine being told about it directly and truthfully, and I'd like to think I'd use whatever information I got to transform and grow. But it's very strange, because we often think about ghosting in the romantic sense, right? Like a date that, or someone you've been on dates with just disappearing and not giving you a reason why. And so it is strange, to be haunted like this and to be ghosted in a professional context, and it feels more intimate than it should. I'll be waiting for my 5-year-old daughter to zip up her jacket and find myself thinking about it, wondering why. And it's precisely this not knowing, the lack of information, that distinguishes ghosting from rejection. That ambiguity, writes Adam Popesco in the New York Times, is the real dagger. And that is not, unfortunately, my only experience with ghosting in the academy. Sometimes when I'm brushing my teeth, I'll think about the job search committees that never bothered to let me know I was no longer under consideration. While picking up stray socks, I'll remember the mentor who just ignored email after email. And driving into work, I'll be reminded of a collaborator who simply dropped off the face of the earth, and the whole thing is humiliating. I am not alone, though. So again, I spoke to many, many academics, who described similar feelings, feeling muddled, discombobulated, and disoriented by this lack of closure. One professor who called herself a whistleblower at her university described feeling the triumvirate of D's: discarded, defeated, and disposable. An assistant professor in Germany observed, after several colleagues who accepted her invitation to edit a special issue of a scientific journal disappeared, she said, "I can't help but think they would have never ghosted a senior male academic from the Ivy League." For many, being ghosted resulted in enhanced feelings of isolation in an already isolating profession. And indeed, we're in a profession, right, academia, that is full of imposter syndrome, and self-blame is natural, which makes this widespread phenomenon even worse. As one of my sources wrote, "I spend much of my time trying to compensate for the lack of actual information with speculation and self-incrimination, imagining all kinds of scenarios, none of which are favorable to me." And this internalized sense of worthlessness is threaded throughout all the interviews I conducted with those who were ghosted, despite most recognizing, at least intellectually, that they deserved better. They deserved explanations and information. And what's more, some of my sources even described debilitating physical responses to being ghosted and the feelings that they were grappling with. And often it was because the situation exasperated pre-existing mental illness. One source who was ghosted by her advisor told me she still wakes up multiple times in the middle of the night in a state of near panic, but she worried she'd be seen as pathetic for saying so. And she was far from the only source to describe ongoing sleep disruptions due to anxiety. Another source described panic attacks that came with compulsively checking her emails when she was on the job market, for emails that never came. Another wrote that the pain of rejection morphed into kind of a bodily paralysis. So she experienced major disc degeneration in her neck, as the muscles in my chest and upper back ceaselessly and involuntary grip around my shoulders and ribs, and so she takes muscle relaxants daily. So although it is often not, and I'll get more into that later, but ghosting often feels like a deeply cruel, calculated, and personal act, a deliberate choice. Some ghosters I talked to characterize ghosting in their case as due to apathy, a kind of accidental dismissal, an attempt to wait for the problem to disappear and resolve itself, or for the person in question to take the hint. But ghosting leaves one party without resolution, and it is ultimately a choice, allowing the ghost to keep a convenient distance, a choice that would certainly warrant consequences in other professions. I'll just pause here. My father is a businessman. He has no idea about anything to do with Shakespeare or what I do or early modern literature or drama, but he does try to read my stuff. And he read this piece and he talked about how, as a businessman, he has to make those calls, right? He has to deliver information that is going to be uncomfortable. And for him, that's a big part of his integrity as a leader and a businessman, is being able to have those difficult conversations, and to be able to communicate with people clearly and directly. And he said that he learned this in part when he was interviewing for jobs. There was one where he was in the running for at Pfizer, and the guy called him and he was like, look, I will know in a couple of weeks whether I can offer you the job. I think I can, but I just wanted you to know, in case you had any other offers on the table, where we were in this process of consideration. And he said that he always remembered that phone call, right? Because um, it wasn't a yes, but it was something that made him feel like a human being. It was a gesture that made him feel like a human being, and it helped him make the decision to take another job, which he stayed in his entire life. So there are things we get away with in academia that wouldn't necessarily fly in other professions. And Zeb Larson, a freelance journalist and independent scholar, chalks this pervasive phenomenon up to the academy's weak structures for any reciprocity. Those were his words. And those weak structures, of course, affect you differently depending on who you are. Those with power can appear and disappear at will without consequences. For the ghostee, though, the pain and humiliation linger. It felt, one academic told me, as if I was not worthy of even one conversation. Another said that being ghosted made them feel like human garbage, some sort of unhygienic filth to be scrubbed from the work environment. So perhaps the most common instance of academic ghosting is how candidates are or aren't rejected in job searches. So in academia, as some of you may know, you'll get an interview, a campus visit, rounds and rounds of meetings and emails with your prospective employers, and then nothing. In March of 2019, Amanda LaCastro, who's now a digital scholarship librarian at Swarthmore College, spent 3 days at another small college on the East Coast as a finalist in a job search, giving teaching and research talks and meeting numerous people. By the time May came, she had still not heard anything from the committee, so she accepted another institution's offer. Months later, she was cleaning out her department locker mailbox, and she found a form letter saying the position was no longer available. She told me, quote, no one from the committee contacted me, wrote a personal note, or even signed the letter. I still can't believe, after spending likely over $1,000 on interviewing me and eating several meals with me, no one bothered to even send me an email. And this was not her only experience with ghosting on the job market. For another position, she was asked to make a video after a first round interview to send to the committee, a task that took up a lot of her time and energy. And after sending it, she never heard back. 3 years later, though, she received an HR-generated email saying they had moved on to other candidates. What she suspects happened is that it was just someone's job to clear out all the old unresolved job advertisements from their system, meaning a lot of people got generic automated emails at once. And I actually spoke to a department chair at a small liberal arts college who was recently charged with setting up procedures for faculty search. And he told me that his attempts to offer candidates maximum transparency throughout the process were shot down by administration. He said, "It has to do with some misguided sense that giving candidates this bad news will make them sour on our institution and make it harder to recruit them later if we wind up inviting more people to campus." For him, these sentiments are out of touch with the way information is now disseminated online and graduate students' sober understanding of the state of the job market. Indeed, if you've heard of it, there's the academic jobs wiki, right? Which is sort of like a crowdsourced space where people on the job market can update certain pages to say they got a second round interview or a campus visit, right? So you can check the job wiki, and if you haven't heard, but other people have, you can assume the search has moved on without you. And that wiki has entries dated back to 2009. Karen Kelsky, founder of The Professor Is In, told me that the reason that administrators don't want to send those emails is that to say you are no longer under consideration is awkward at best. It's like pulling teeth to write those emails. Administrators don't want to do it, they don't know how to do it, and there's no one picking up the slack. And Kelsky chalks up the pervasive nature of ghosting in part to academics' guilt and profound denial over the state of academic hiring today. To not keep academics updated on their status for her is cowardice, evasion, and avoidance. But ghosting is not only suffered by newly minted PhDs at early stages of their career. Julie H. Lee, who's a professor of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Irvine, was recently a finalist for a senior position at a private institution on the East Coast. After her virtual campus visit, the chair sent a warm email letting her know they would decide shortly, only to never follow up again. For Lee, this kind of ghosting is an expression of deep structural inequities that the university perpetuates. She told me jobs are scarce, applicants are aplenty, so what difference does it make if we do or do not notify people about their status in a job search? Another professor I spoke with described a similar scenario to LaCastro and Lee. 3 rounds of interviews, a teaching demo on the topic of the department's choosing, only to never hear back, even when she sent follow-up emails. She told me, and this totally breaks my heart, she said, "Am I so valueless they can't even be bothered to tell me to go away?" And so I'll pause here to admit that sending in a job application, resume, or the like and not hearing back doesn't constitute ghosting, in my opinion. Although I do wonder if the breadth of materials required for academic job searches sets academia apart from other professions. For me, what becomes ethically questionable in all professions is ghosting after second or third round interviews, and especially a campus visit. If you want to make the very problematic parallel, which I've made anyways, between, ghosting and dating, right? Swiping left on someone is not ghosting, but swiping right, meeting up, and then disappearing certainly is. And the amount of preparation required aside, these stages require face-to-face interaction. And of note, none of my sources even mentioned the expectation of detailed feedback on why they weren't chosen, simply an acknowledgement that they and their time existed. As Lisa Earle McLeod concludes in her article, "Ghosting at Work, When Is It Okay?" a prompt one-sentence response is rarely too much to ask. So ghosting on the job market is perhaps the most commonplace, but there are other more insidious forms of ghosting in academia. So several graduate students told me of being suddenly ghosted by an advisor, sometimes mid-project, despite institutional policies in place to prevent this kind of behavior. We all know that advisors are integral to their advisees' professional success. Faculty mentors are one of the biggest deciding factors when students decide to apply to graduate programs. Without a supervisor supporting you and having integral conversations about how your work fits into a field, you are at a serious long-term disadvantage. And advisors are the kind of people who can open many doors for those they support and can therefore also shut them. What's more, the student-advisor relationship is both personal and professional. Many of my sources describe the esteem they once held for the advisor who ghosted them. One described, quote, intense feelings of personal loss. More than one person I spoke with used the phrase, "it breaks my heart." As one graduate student wrote, "I trusted my dissertation chair with my life, admired her to the point of always being kind of starstruck around her, and would have practically died to get her approval or praise on anything." Okay, and while some academics might recoil from statements like these in a professional context, I think it's very important to attend to them. Sometimes I think this is just so much of the work I do is looking at those emotions, right? Attending to the emotions that we like to pretend don't exist in objective academic work. I know that I too trusted my advisors with my future in the profession when I was in graduate school, a huge part of my life and my family's livelihood. After all, my success in the program and profession was in large part in their hands. And I too admired and sought approval and praise from my advisors. I too was often devastated by their critique, and I too wondered if, when emails went unanswered over long periods of time, it was a reflection on me and my work. Now that I act as an advisor to students, I try very hard, and trust me, I'm exhausted. I'm a mother. I could go through the list, but I try very hard to be cognizant of the power I have over their futures, from writing recommendation letters on time to guiding them through the publishing process to offering them pep talks. It's not pathetic to need this kind of guidance and validation from your advisors. I mean, we all do. So in short, it's easy to say or to think it's not personal when an advisor ghosts you, but it is. As one source wrote, it is you, not just your project, that they are judging. You are imbricated in your project. And so these disappearing acts obviously have consequences beyond hurt feelings. It comes with financial implications, right? Students must navigate expired funding and extra tuition, unread dissertation chapters in hand. In my interviews, advisors who ghosted often delayed graduation, resulting in more semesters and consequently more tuition. Another told me that her advisor ghosting her and other students cost them thousands of dollars. One academic who was ghosted by an advisor in her MA program went as far as suggesting that the academy is complicit in financial fraud by not holding accountable its members who students rely on for their future success. And so perhaps the most cruelest incarnation of academic ghosting is enacted on those with little power in the academy, and that is contingent faculty and those in need of accommodation and inclusion. In this sense, administrators and advisors ghosting academics in need is a form of cowardice and also self-preservation. For academics still reaching for a tenure-line position, asking for a letter of recommendation years after graduation should be as easy as asking a committee member to revise an earlier letter. Sometimes all that's needed is an updated date. After having to wrangle dissertation committees into a successful defense and maintaining years and sometimes decades-long relationships with advisors, and adjuncts having to make this request is almost comical in its simplicity. It seems absurd to abandon a mentee after all this. It's heartbreaking then that many of my sources spoke about advisors ghosting them after graduation. As a professor in Hispanic studies described it, there was, quote, complete radio silence when I wasn't looking him in the eyes. It felt as though I no longer had any worth to him. Katina Rogers, author of Putting the Humanities PhD to Work, described her advisor's disappointment and ensuing silence when she decided to pursue an alt-act career, so not a tenure-track job. When he ignored an email she wrote him to tell him her book had come out, she described feeling, quote, a little bitter, a little pathetic for reaching out to him in the first place, and a little like an academic fraud. And this ghosting is part of a larger troubling pattern that emerged in my research for this piece, and again, which is people in power ghosting those in need of accommodation and inclusion. And it's precisely because academia and academics perform a great discourse about inclusion that the pervasive nature of ghosting is so insidious compared to other professions. For example, a graduate student at a large state university described the devastating process of attempting to have a mediated conversation with her advisor about her progress and some actions bordering on disability discrimination. It was during a one-on-one discussion with the mediator that my source, was informed that her dissertation chair would not participate and that she was explicitly forbidden to communicate with her again. Yet another contingent scholar described coming out as trans and having an advisor ghost them after they did so. And by default, their entire research group, making finishing the PhD according to plan totally untenable. But I am happy to report that the student is at a new university in a better program and feels like they won in the end. So good for them. Still shouldn't have happened. And an associate professor I interviewed described a dean who ghosted her after her efforts to center diversity, equity, and inclusion in our unit. And this same dean who ghosted her went around purporting to be, in other contexts, someone who welcomes difficult conversations. So it's now triggering for that source when any administrator makes statements about how they support all members of our community and condemn all forms of abuse, discrimination, retaliation. For her, the disconnect between statements like this and her experience of being ghosted suggests that she doesn't count. It's like a denial of her existence. And that this language, this lip service, is pervasive in the academy when ghosting in all contexts is precisely about avoiding difficult conversation. It's cruel. As one of my sources said, her ghosts preferred to avoid a possibly difficult conversation, a conversation which would have revealed, among other things, the limits of their commitment to equity and inclusion. So the question becomes how to hold ghosts accountable, how to relearn how to communicate with one another, how to face conflict in clear, direct, and truthful ways. I fear that I don't have much of a good answer for this, other than to acknowledge, right, that these conversations are difficult, and that, setting boundaries clearly and in understandable, specific ways, and giving people the information they need, no matter how much it might hurt them, is part of being a professional. But the psychologist Janice Vilauer told the New York Times, quote, "It's really important to remember if someone ghosts you, that behavior says more about them than you. It's about their discomfort." And I thought about that a lot, right? When I was writing this article and gathering sources, I suppose Twitter sort of learned what to put in my feeds. So all of these tweets about ghosting started coming up, and I was struck by one in particular that read, if someone ghosts you, respect the dead and never disturb them again. If someone gives you the silent treatment, enjoy your quiet time. Normalize not taking things personally, letting people be themselves without trying to change or control them, and living your life accordingly. I think this tweet is seductive in some ways. Like, surely these sentiments are shared by maybe even some of you listening to this talk, but by academics and administrators alike. That those of us who've been ghosted need to toughen up, so to speak, and not take it personally. And what's more, this advice sort of only speaks to the only option some of us who have been ghosted in professional contexts have. I mean, so many of my sources spoke of their trepidation to disturb the dead with even a follow-up email. But in my opinion, this is too easy a way out, right? It's too easy to just sort of excuse ghosting, as it demonstrates this lack of respect. It's unprofessional and immature. To then say that those of us who've been ghosted need to respect the process and not take it personally is an easy way out, right? What's more difficult is to tackle the structural conditions in the academy that allow for this ghosting to happen in the first place. Because, and some of you may disagree with me about this, but I feel, the academy is in crisis, especially the humanities, right? I wrote in my piece, this haunted house is crumbling around us. The rafters are rotting, rats are scurrying across the floor, spider webs crisscross the windows, old couches covered in white plastic collect dust. But still, many of us feel at home here, right? We leave only when it's clear there's no room for us any longer, when it's clear we're talking to the walls. Karen Kelsky told me that as it stands in academia, everyone is burnt out. Everybody is exhausted. Everyone is utterly overwhelmed. But there are some scholars I've seen, and they tend to be early career women and people of color who are trying to deal with these conditions. I saw a tweet, and I don't think anyone should have to do this single-handedly, but it was a woman of color professor who made sure every one of her applicants for the job that she was sharing the job search, she was sharing, heard about their status when it was updated. And she said it took her forever, but she felt that the people deserve to know. And so there are people who are trying to deal with these conditions. We are trying to renovate to make the whole place safer, more welcoming. We're trying to add rooms to guide guests through the various mazes, to build a more stable foundation. And we take on this labor because renovating is the professional thing to do. Building an academy where structures encourage us to be accountable to one another, to set and communicate boundaries, and to show up as best we can. That's the work. And as I close my piece, and as I do believe, I think we owe each other more as academics. Thank you. Okay. Let's see.
Well, I guess my first comment is I don't know what to say other than thank you.
Oh.
Your honest, authentic, kind and caring concern for how to restore faith and trust.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm very my students kind of make fun of me sometimes
No,
because
no, not me. I am saluting you. I am honoring you.
Oh, thank you.
I am expressing my appreciation for your courage.
Oh, thank you.
And if there is
I don't know,
one
like,
word which I wish to emphasize, it is your courage.
yeah,
Thank
people
you.
are always
Thank
like,
you.
you're so brave. And I don't know if that one of my colleagues, Suzanne, is here. I don't know if when people are like, you're so brave, they're like, you're so stupid, Alicia. But
Well,
no,
I hope that we will find a path forward to turn things around, to help make the world a better place, even in academia. And so it's not just about restoring trust and faith and democracy and all people's civil rights for all persons. It's also about finding a path forward to restore trust and faith in academia. So I have no other word than to express my sincere thanks and appreciation for your courage.
thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I too want to thank you for your really lovely talk because it made me think of so many situations where I might have been ghosted and where I intentionally didn't ghost others. I ran a fellowship program here for a couple of years. Well, I guess 5. And then I handed it to a junior faculty member who wanted to take it over for me. And then I found out that she failed to send rejection email, letter, anything to the applicants who weren't taken. And I have to say that I found that so shocking that she would not know. And she said, well, people didn't reply to her, or didn't tell her that she was being rejected back in the day. So she didn't realize that anyone would have done that.
Yeah.
And I just sort of sat there and I said, well, I kept a draft of what I sent to all of those applicants. And there were years where we literally had 100. And yeah, it takes a while because you don't want to just send a sort of form letter to them. You want to sort of give them a little information. But I was just totally blown away that anyone would treat applicants to a program like that. But I think it's not only on application that people get ghosted.
No.
I think that sometimes there's even a mass effort, if you will, to ghost a person who's doing work in your same field who you don't want to have to deal with the fact that you have competition. And you and your group then ghost that person, which could mean that they don't get offered to have a platform presentation at a meeting, or they don't get a publication, or they don't. It's basically, let's get rid of that competitor. We're at a more powerful institution, so we can play with their lives.
Oh, do you all have the cool groups in your fields?
Oh, sure.
I mean, there's certainly a cool group in my field, and if you're out with them, you're out, you know? Yep. And they cause a lot of harm.
So,
and you know, I think competition is a big thing. You know, like I was just thinking the other day, my chair sent me, when I work on queer pregnancy, I'm delighted if anyone else in academia is working on it, because it's not a very common thing to be working on. But I have had people say like, oh no, they're presenting on queer pregnancy, you've got to get your book out. I'm like, I'm happy to have the collaboration. I'm happy to have the community. Like, I'm happy. It's an important topic to me, so I'm glad that people are working on it, you know. But I do think academia creates that pits us against each other, right? And one thing I don't want to do in my work is villainize anybody, but I do think there's some of us that have more power than others. And I've often been told, like, when people are like, you're so brave, right? I've been told, you shouldn't be talking about these things. You're not tenured. You don't have tenure. Like, I've been told that by some mentors. But I have power in that I'm at a well-known institution. You know, that email address gets me looked at. And what happens if I just stay silent for 5-6 years and then I don't get tenure anyways, you know? And I feel like there are some of us with more power than others, and the more power you have, the more I feel there is an onus to use it towards creating better conditions for everybody. And so, you know, that's sort of where, I mean, there's always going to be one with more power than you. It's how do you use the power you have for good? I think about that a lot, and a lot of it has to do with kind of breaking down these, you know, like the competition you described, that we're all out for itself, that this profession can be so isolating, you know, and it doesn't have to be. And Suzanne, I saw your message, but do you want to put your comment in the chat?
Suzanne, can you turn on your mic? Oh, there we go.
I can turn on my mic. I'm used to Zoom, and I guess my computer's not playing well with GoToMeeting. I was just going to say, I mean, I last ran a search before the one that brought you here.
Yeah.
And I haven't run one since, but I do remember so that HR is very strict about what kind of communications, human resources, And so one of the things that, also factors into this side of ghosting is, how much of this is determined by university policies. Obviously, once the search is over and everyone's got the official letters from either the chair or whoever generates them. And I know in many cases that the chair or HR, not this search committee chair, that does that.
Yeah.
But, so some of it is institutional policy kind of precludes, because let's face it, universities are worried about getting sued all the time. And so, it's ironic that it's actually, you would think like human resources would be more about treating people like human beings, that some people, chairing searches might feel like their hands are tied precisely because of their human resources department and all the policies and hoops that they have to jump through. It's like NCAA recruitment rules, like, right? They're not. So I just wonder, obviously, like I said, I don't know how it's done at my institution like this year, because it's been several years since I did that. But it's something to consider that, some people who are on the search committee end of this might wish to be more forthcoming, especially I think the reasons that people aren't.
Oh yeah.
That's a real tricky thing. But, and obviously it's, like I said, the irony is that it is the human resources department that is stopping individuals who might otherwise, and part of it, as you pointed out, everyone's exhausted. And so, after having the exhaustion of running a search on top of all your other duties, then trying to reach out to all the people that were interviewed. Now, I agree to you with you that people who came to campus for visits, ought to get, more than, just a form letter from HR. But, I've been in this a long time, and I think, things have changed, but I'm trying to remember. I went to several campuses when I was on the job market for the first time 25 years ago. And I think the only campus that I actually heard from other than a form letter was the one where I got the job.
Yeah. Yeah.
So sadly, the institution has been crumbling a lot more so in the last 25 years, but I'm not sure that, this fundamental disconnect or, has really changed. Anyway, I don't want to go on too long.
No, I'm glad you said that, Suzanne, because I've talked to people who have had very creative ways around the HR thing. Like some search committees will actually update the job wiki themselves, and you can do so anonymously. So that's a way for people to get information. The chair that I quoted that I talked to here went to administration and specifically asked about the HR policies and why they were in place, and he couldn't really give him a good reason. And it's actually why he wanted to be anonymous, because he was like, look, this is the conversation I had. They just don't want people to sour on our institution. It's this very misguided, thing. And I do feel like if there was more of a pushback, right? Like if there was more people asking questions and more creativity around how can we treat people like human beings, I feel like we could come up with some stuff, right? Instead of, like it's easy to kind of say like, especially when you're exhausted, like, oh, there's all this tape, right? This red tape. But I know that I had another campus visit the year I was on the market with William and Mary, and then 2 interviews at other institutions, and I heard nothing. And I sat in a room like on Zoom and talked with those people, and I looked them up, I did my research like it, and I envisioned my whole life there, because you have to prepare for an interview. Then just to hear nothing is kind of like, it's dehumanizing, and so I think academia can do better, but we just have to be creative and like drink more coffee or something.
Drink more coffee together.
Yes. Drink more coffee together and talk about these things. Yeah.
Um, I,
If I may.
yes, please.
So yeah, this was a very powerful talk. You had a lot of very important things to say about the state of these communications, and I can also speak to having not heard back after interviewing from places, and frankly, even a form letter, even if it's bad news, is still closure. So
Yes.
yeah, but what I'm wondering is, what would you consider the solution to be then? Like setting sort of specific rules or standards and communicating those, like telling a whoever is doing the making the call that they have to upfront, that they have to reply to everyone, and setting up some specific consequence for them if they don't, or does there have to be more than that,
I
like
mean,
getting at the roots of the problem, the imbalances of power,
yeah.
the
Yeah.
exhaustion?
Yes. Yes. I mean, all of this, it's so funny. I always say, like, you know, everything that gives me hope and faith is like personal efforts, right? It's like like there, Jose Munoz calls them these then and there moments of utopia and a poisonous present where we take care of each other, and he says to look to those moments, like despite these crushing kind of bureaucracies and structures, and right, like the moments where one person kind of makes a difference, right? Like how can we model structural change on those moments, right? So like the woman that I was describing who reached out to each applicant to just update them on their status, like, is there a way to take some of that burden of work off of her? Like Karen Kelsky actually wrote a response to my, it was kind of a rude response, but whatever. She was like, it takes money to be moral. So her solution was to hire more administrative assistants to do this work, which, like to me, it's just sort of like, okay, I guess, but if it doesn't solve the problem of going on a campus visit and making connections and then just getting a form letter, right? Um, but you could think about that. So how could we redistribute that labor of letting people know so it's not just on this one heroic woman of color professor, right, who's trying to be just. Or like, so looking to those moments where things were done right. It was actually funny. When I got the call, I got my job. Like I wasn't the first pick, so enough time had elapsed that I thought I wasn't going to get the job. And Suzanne, my chair at the time, she's now my dean, I saw her number and my first thought was, oh my gosh, she's calling me to tell me I didn't get it. I knew that she was such an amazing person, right? And then of course she was calling me to tell me I got it, but I always remember that moment because, and my dad's story, because I'm like, what does it mean? What would it mean if for every finalist, campus finalist, they got a phone call? Like that's human. Like that's really humanizing, It takes a lot of strength on the part of the person saying no, and it takes, but it's really meaningful. So I think my short answer, the short answer to your question is finding things that are already working on like a micro level, right? Like where people put forth compassionate personal efforts to make things better. And I talk about this in my mental illness piece. Like almost every mentally ill academic I interviewed that has made it is because someone in power made personal efforts to accommodate them. Not HR, right? Like an advisor, a mentor, somebody. So how can we make those personal efforts structural? So that's what I would say. I would say, like, I'm always looking for those moments where things do work, right? And how can we make that more systematic? How can we make those efforts more systematic, and then kind of going from there? But I think you're right. It's so many things. It's labor and lack of jobs and so many applicants and exhaustion and, this isolation, and it can feel so overwhelming. But one thing that's helped me is to just like, okay, this is working here on a micro level. Like, how can we expand this? How is this a blueprint? Like, that has really helped me.
I have a quick question, and it stemmed from me mishearing something you said and then quickly
Oh, yeah.
realizing. But I misheard ghost E for ghoster,
Oh,
and
yeah.
it brought up this question in my mind of, and I imagine that there isn't really a great answer right now, but just a question for future.
Mhm.
But not necessarily for applications, because for context, I am recently graduated from undergrad. So all of my friends, and I, we're all applying to jobs en masse. We almost expect to hear nothing,
Yeah.
probably 95% of the time. But the question is more, what are the motivations behind actually ghosting someone in outside of that question of job application? And
Yeah.
I wonder how and what someone who's actually ghosted someone would say as, well, this is what happened, this is why. I'd be very curious. If you have any stories to that extent, but
Oh,
if
I
you don't,
mean,
if you have any thoughts.
so I actually, if you can still see, I actually did a podcast on this article for This Academic Life, and I talk more about this because at first her first question was, okay, so tell me the details about that colleague that ghosted you. And I was like, oh God, I knew I was going to get this in interviews. You know what? There was a part of me that hoped that they would read the piece. Like, this is all my pieces, right? That they would read the piece and then they would sort of come forward and be like, I'm sorry, here's what you did. And we could like have a conversation, but they didn't. But I think for me, like, it always comes back to, you want to avoid having a difficult conversation. And in some cases, it can be a safety issue. Like, if you are, like, taking it back to the dating allegory or whatever, if you're a woman who's rejecting a man or, something like that, right? Like, there could be real risks, or real fears about safety and consequences. So it's a case by case thing, but I think in general, it's, you want to avoid having a difficult conversation. And I think we're not really ever trained to have those hard conversations. Like, the best people I know are people who can have difficult conversations, and stay present through it, for the person, not react, not get. I mean, we need more training in this. This is why the humanities matters. I'm getting up on my pedestal, like, because you but those difficult conversations where you will hurt someone also gives them the closure they need to heal, and perhaps also like the information they need to become better. But I think ghosting is at heart about wanting to avoid discomfort. We're really bad at being uncomfortable, and we need, I'm saying this for myself too. Like, I need to get better at it. I'm always working on it. Yeah, I think it's not wanting to have a difficult conversation.
Yeah,
That's
that
that's
really makes sense.
it's interesting though, because I think that some of the people who ghost others, it's not because they don't want to have the difficult conversation. It's because they don't want to put in any extra time
Yeah.
in whatever the relationship is. For whatever reason, they're ghosting. So are they ghosting because, oh, I've had a dozen applicants and I'm just going to ignore everybody who I'm not hiring? Or is it because, oh, that's a person who is competing with me for a grant and I just don't even want to talk to them? Or are they ghosting because the person was a whistleblower and you don't want to have anything to do with somebody who was a whistleblower because it then taints you
Yeah.
as being in that camp? I mean, there's so many reasons why people ghost.
Yeah.
I
It's
just think they all think they can get away with it. I
yeah.
think that they think nobody's ever going to confront them.
And then I come around with my
Well,
Chronicle article. But you know what's so funny is that I had so many people reach out to me since I wrote this piece and say, I had someone approach me. Like I had job search directors reach out to me after they read your article and say, I'm sorry, I know you didn't hear from me. I'm sorry. And I'm like, that is so moving to me. That's so meaningful because that's what they needed. Like that gave them something, like to get an apology, to get the closure. You know, one of my closest friends said she was at a conference and a person on that committee from years ago approached her and said, I'm really sorry we never said anything to you. And I was like, that's a start, right? Like that's a start.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the worst of it is when the person who is ghosted, so the ghostee, really takes all of this to heart and changes their plan or
Yeah.
leaves their field or feels they're being forced from their field
Yeah.
or, they thought that they were going to become a faculty member and now they're looking for a job elsewhere and staying away from academia because of the intense hurt that has happened to them.
Yes.
Um,
And I talk to many people like that. And
yeah,
I think it's a huge loss and it sort of goes back to what I was saying, like if we don't start talking about these feelings and emotions and these difficult things, that bar some people's paths in academia, we're going to keep losing really brilliant minds, like,
yeah,
really brilliant people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now you're getting to the core of the matter.
Yeah.
If we allow this bad behavior, I'm just going to use a simple phrase, it's bad behavior.
Mm-hmm.
It's uncivil behavior.
Mm-hmm.
It is behavior that runs counter to a basic structural requirement that I will make an appeal for. There are questions about how to move forward with tactical, strategic, structural changes. We must require evaluations of faculty and teachers and professors for their ability to serve as role models of good behavior. What is good behavior? Good behavior is the opposite of bad behavior. Good behavior is nothing more than engaging in a civil, polite, courteous, and respectful manner. Is that how you treat your fellow students? Is that how you treat your fellow adjuncts? Is that how you treat your fellow professors? So a clear and explicit structural change that we can make is all of us collectively making an appeal that faculty tenure should include evaluation of that faculty professor's behavior as a good citizen and a good role model for all of the people around them, including their students. If they cannot serve as a good teacher, a good role model of good civil, courteous, respectful behavior, they should not get tenure. So that's a very clear and explicit structural change. Please write another blog post or another article about it for the Chronicles.
The problem is that the perpetrators who have the bad behavior sometimes are doing whatever they're doing that's bad behavior in order to attain tenure for themselves. In other words, to undermine their competition.
Yeah.
And it becomes a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
And a lot of times the people who are best at falsifying their data or the best at, oops, somebody just crashed something in my hall. I don't know. It's outside the office and I don't hear anybody screaming, so we're going to think it's just a
Well,
thing.
I do have to go pick up my daughter from
Yeah.
school. I'm so sorry, but thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for staying around to listen to me, and I really love this conference, and I love connecting with all of you. So thank you so much.
Alicia, you are welcome back anytime.
Okay,
You are welcome
Yes.
back anytime.
Absolutely.
And, thank you.